Hi, Terry Bolt here with Chapter 6 of our TWIST book, How to Create Tactical Stories. Our quote for this week is from Oprah Winfrey. I believe everybody has a story worth telling, but precious few know how to get it down on paper, or in her case, how to get it out on TV. She's a media mogul, has done a lot of work telling people stories and getting the audience interested. We've already spent some time in this book on looking at defining our objectives and opportunities, doing some research and audience analysis, and started last chapter was about why we tell stories and why storytelling is so effective. And this chapter we're going to look at how we tell those stories and how, at least the beginning of it. So there are two halves to the word storytelling: story and telling. And we're going to first start this chapter with more about what is a story and how to structure it. And then the second part of this will be about telling the story in terms of how we tell a story in terms of structure. The actual interactive part of storytelling as an interactive art, what Dr. Haven is very good at, is not something we're going to get into in this chapter. So when we talk about storytelling, there's this thing called the storytelling triangle, which is commonly used within the oral storytelling community. And the idea here is you really have three things: you, the audience, and the story. And as you're designing your story, you want to make it relate to the audience, but then you want to go deeper. When you're telling the story, there's times when you're going to use the way you tell the story to pull the audience in so that they're engaged in the story, almost as though they're part of it. That's the ideal part of the storytelling. But then there's the story itself, and so you want to sometimes focus on the story, and sometimes you might actually pull back out of the story and get the audience to think about themselves. Or there's times you might mediate the story towards yourself. If you're telling a personal story or to relate to the audience, you might give them some background to build some of your credibility. All of those are things that are part of the traditional art of storytelling, is to mediate in this triangle where you want to be. Do you want to be very close to a vertex, or do you want to be moving from one to another? As we're going to do tactical storytelling, we're going to view this as now a tetrahedron because we really have a tactical objective. And our tactical objective is generally to get the audience to do something. It might be to know something, but generally it's to do something. And so our story has to motivate the audience more than just engaging them in thinking about things. It has to engage them in doing things. That's the kind of impact we want to have. So traditionally, many stories have had some call to action, right? They've just not been made as explicit as I'm making it here. And the interesting thing is, so now we have 4 vertices in our tetrahedron, and we might want to navigate between any one of those 4. The tactical objective of what we're trying to achieve might be something we could achieve with many, many different stories. And so we're going to have to choose which story to tell. And then given that we've chosen that story, when we're telling it, we might want the audience to think about the story itself. We might want them to think about the tactical objective, or we might actually want the audience to be blissfully unaware of what our real tactical objective is, and so focused on the story they get pulled in, and we achieve our objective without ever telling them exactly what that was. So that mediation now between the tactical objective and the story is part of what we have to craft as we're going through this. So just a quick reminder from the last chapter, right, that we're going to look at things in terms of the human brain and how it's going to understand stories. And Dr. Haven made a good case that the human brain is predisposed to think in story terms, to make sense of things, to understand and to remember. And if we want to have our objective met, we have to have the audience make sense, understand, and remember what we're saying. And we have to be very careful because the neural story net that lies between the external and the internal mind distorts information in order to make it sense to them. It may make sense to you, but it may not to them. The story they see and the story they hear is not necessarily the story you said. And so we want to make sure we're applying effective story structure in our tactical communications to minimize that distortions. So we're going to want to make sure we're dealing with the fact, because as they listen, they're going to routinely change, reverse factual information, make assumptions, create new information, ignore parts of your presentation, infer connections and information, infer motive, intelligence, significance, and misinterpret it. So the more we can design our story process to make sure these things are not likely to occur given the story and how we're telling it and what we know about the audience, the stronger our tactical communication will be. So the first part of our story process and how stories work is we really have to merge our content with effective story structure. So as we want to merge that content, we have to think about what is our tactical objective, and we have to think about what makes it an effective story structure. So in his second book, Story Smart, Dr. Haven puts forward what he calls the Magnificent Seven. It's 7 things that are always going on in the human mind as they interpret story. And we actually saw some examples of this in chapter 5. But I just want to briefly touch on each of these: experience, structure, meaning, intent, gaps, characters, and conflicts. And he has cute titles to go with each one of these. So in fact, before I go on, so he is experience, play it again, Sam. Structure, order in the court. Meaning, get my meaning. He actually doesn't have the first words. I added that to my presentation. He has just the second part. Why do you think those kinds of phrases are there? Why does he say intent drives the car? Why does he say mad about what's missing? Right? Well, when you're trying to get people to remember stuff and you're trying to give them meaning and knowledge, right, it actually helps to give them something you can hold on to. So play it again, Sam is a quote from Casablanca, a well-known movie, but it's actually become almost an idiom by itself. People understand what it's going to be used for, even though you're not actually telling somebody you want them to play it again, and they're not Sam, right? Or order in the court, right? Again, a phrase we've heard dozens of times. This makes it easier for you to remember because now you've chunked it together. You've got this one idea, and when you're putting that into the process, you know exactly what that is. And so it can make it a lot easier to remember because you can remember these various things. You can see someone driving the car, and that's what's going to go on. So let's briefly go over each of these and how those impact us. So the key point of the Play It Again, Sam, of the Magnificent Seven is really that there's a role of past experiences in narrative processing. Every reader has whatever experiences they have, and they're going to be brought to bear. But it goes a little bit deeper than that because that experience modifies the brain structure. They have connections, and so a certain word like intent drives the car or play it against Sam instantly bring up certain connotations. But if we also understand story structure, so if somebody's familiar with detective novels, that framework will help them grasp a new story of the same genre. As soon as they recognize a structure, even if they don't cognitively recognize the structure, as soon as the brain starts seeing a structure it's used to, it's going to start making predictions of what's going to happen, and they're going to try and fill in parts. And at least the standard story parts will be there and make it both easier to follow and more memorable for them to deal with. And you have to remember that goes 2 ways. If the experience you accidentally invoke is a negative one, then you can make your story worse. You can make it so the audience instantly brings up negative connotations. And in a highly polarized world, depending on what you're doing, that can be as simple as one word or one phrase that triggers them into a negative connotation. So you've got to choose your words carefully. We're not actually into word choice within this chapter, but it's the kind of thing. Their experience is important, and that's how it's going to matter. So structure is also very important, and structure is actually part of our experience. The detective structure, story structure, is a kind of structure. So the mind there's a mind's need for organization. It's going to really try and figure out what's going on. And so a well-structured story that fits into our mental framework makes it easier. If you have a story with a logical sequence of challenges, unknown causes, investigation, resolution, that satisfies our minds. We're used to thinking of those kinds of things. I'm sure you've all seen movies where things are almost a jumble of ideas coming back and forth, or you've read not necessarily well-written things that have that sort of lack of structure. You want there to be a structure. We'll talk later in this chapter about multiple structures, but you want there to be one, and you want to think about what's going to be, and in some sense, you want that structure to fit well with what you're doing. If you're doing something that is a little bit of a detective, you're trying to figure out something new, then a detective story makes sense. But if I'm looking at something from sort of a hero's journey, and I don't have a hero, it's not going to work. So you got to figure out what story structure is going to work for you. And we'll talk about that later in the chapter. Okay, so this one's a little trickier, which is the mind's searching for meaning. It's always looking. We naturally seek out why and how. So our minds are searching for that underlying message, whether it's a moral lesson or a deeper emotional truth. And it can be much more effective if you let your reader dwell on it before revealing the answer. However, in most tactical communications, you can't let that go for too long. In fact, we'll talk about particular styles of tactical communications for business where you can't really let them dwell on it for all. You have to tell them why and how up front to make sure they get it. It's less interesting, but sometimes that can be very effective. But way too many students, when they're writing, end up ignoring the why and the how because to them it's obvious, or they want it to be that the reader can discover it. And there's this balance. My recommendation for almost all technical communications is you should never leave the why and the how implicit. You might leave it implicit for a while. You might let them think about it and get to it on their own, because that's a stronger way. If they figure it out, they are more likely to remember it than if you just tell them. But if they don't figure it out and you don't tell them, then you're not going to reach your tactical objective. So you want to make sure you get that in there. So why and how are an important part of your story. So intent drives the car. We had some examples of this in the last chapter. The role of intent and motive are really important to both add depth to the narrative, but also to make sure people can remember stuff. If they don't see the intent, then it's very hard. Now, this is more important when you're looking at a character's motives that can provide insight into their actions. Why are they doing something? But from a tactical point of view, you also want to make sure you're matching your audience's intent, because that helps drive their engagement. So there's really two different intents going on: your audience and your characters as you're telling your story. And you got to make that interplay. And this is another place when you think about your storytelling triangle tetrahedron, right? There is the story and there's your audience, and you got to find that balance between them. Your audience will, the character's motives might be evil, and that's not your audience intent. Then your audience is, looking to sort of say that that's bad, and they feel a moral judgment going on. And you got to make sure you're matching those two together. So characters can have motives that are not aligned with your audience, but you need to understand where your audience intent is going and use that as part of your driving. So in the gaps, what's mad about missing, which is, again, something we had some examples of, right? The mind has this tremendous ability to fill in the gaps. It has a tremendous need to fill in the gaps. If you put a bunch of things together, the mind really wants to connect them. And so that cognitive efficiency allows us to understand narratives without every detail, which is good and bad. If a narrative mentions a sad character but missed the reasons, our minds fill in the reason. You're going to try and find some reason. You can eventually use this effectively to add a surprise to make a story stick. We'll talk about sticky stories a little bit in this chapter. And so, but surprise is a part of that. But you can also have to be very careful when you're designing your story to think about how they might misfill gaps based on their background. And so you might make sure you have details when you don't want them to fill a gap. And there will be other times when you want to let them infer and fill a gap in a way that is to your advantage without you saying something that isn't maybe exactly what you wanted to say, or it would just take up too much space when you have space limitations. You got to figure what details you can let them fill in, but they will fill in stuff. And the ability to fill in stuff, especially things presented in order, suggests a connection, and we'll be using that. Okay, so characters. Every story is somebody's story, right? So there's the key point here is that in your story, there's going to be characters. And we're going to talk about a much more generalized role of characters as we go through some examples. But they're the emotional and thematic core. They're what drive this. And so you got to think about that character and whether or not they're an actual person, they're an imagined person, or even if they're an anthropomorphized computer system, right? You're talking about things from a character point of view. And this can sometimes be difficult in tactical writing, but generally you can generate a stronger story if you can find a really good character. If the story is not the organization or society or science, if you can't find a person, right, then one of the society, organization, or science can be a character. It can often work depending on what you're writing for and what's going on. But still thinking about them as a character and putting them in the role of the character, even if you're talking about society. It's not a person, but society has a lot of characteristics of a character. And then there's really got to be a struggle. And the role of conflict and struggle and difficulties in stories is sometimes hard for students to comprehend. Your goal is not to make it easy for your hero. Very young children tend to make up stories where they have superheroes with superpowers and everything goes really quickly because they're, as little children, thinking that will make it all easier. But in the end, those don't make very good stories. There's got to be generally some level of conflict. It can be as subtle as the character's internal moral dilemma or as grand as a fight to save the world and stop climate change. You can have whatever you want as a conflict, but that conflict makes it so that there's a reason to worry about the story. And if there isn't a reason, if there isn't a struggle, there probably isn't. So that brings us to, so those are the Magnificent Seven, sorry. And now those are going to show up in terms of how we use them in what are the 8 essential elements of the story. So these are the 8 essential elements. Character traits that make the character somewhat interesting. goal, motive, conflict and problems, risk and danger, struggles, and imagery. And all of these are important, but some of these are a little bit more important. If you think back in a previous chapter, we actually had 6 elements of the bare bones one sentence story, and it was missing a couple of these. See if you can think about which ones are missing and why. Okay, so the ones that were missing were character traits and imagery, and generally those are really important for long term, but if I only have one sentence, it's really hard to get a lot of those in. And so you might get them in, but when we did the one sentence version, those 2 were not there. I would actually say imagery might be as important as all the others, but it can be very hard to get in a one sentence story. But if you get it in, and we'll talk about some techniques using metaphor and simile or analogy, then it's actually great. You can have a one sentence story that easily hits 7, if not all 8 of these. So what are these? So who's the main character, and why is that essential? Well, there's got to be at least one main character. And again, from a story point of view, the reader may relate to them, they may hate them, they may think that's not even really a character at one level, but if you make them sound like a character, they will work into this. And then you can have some traits that make them interesting. The traits can make them interesting by making them relatable, or they can make them antagonistic, and so the audience hates them. Both of those traits can show up, and we have a bunch of stereotypes that show up throughout literature that are used as traits to help make some of that very quickly conveyed to the audience. But it's important to understand, what does a character need to do or to get? That's their goal. And then that's in the story. But there's a separate issue, which is, why is that goal important, which is really a motive. And that goal should be in something that the audience relates to. So the motive is more for the audience member than the goal, which is for the character. And so you want to think about how you're presenting the goal's importance. So if the character's goal, you can have a story, and the character's goal is to eat breakfast, right? And that's not much of a story. But if the character, to many people, that won't be, to you and me, that may not be. But if you're disabled and you can't actually feed yourself, then that can actually become a very important motive for why that goal is important to some people, and we can at least empathize with that and understand what's going on and why that's important. So characters' goals may not to the character be the same as our motive for why that goal is important. And then there's going to be conflicts and problems that block the character, and those may directly produce risk and danger for the character, or they may produce risk and danger for the audience. And this is one of the reasons to separate conflicts and problems from risk and danger. Risk and danger in some stories are actually about global problems or societal problems, and the character has small things, but we see that the risks and dangers are much broader, much bigger. And to overcome the conflicts and problems, the character has to struggle with something. And so the conflicts and problems might also lead to risks and dangers that are internal. The character is depressed or whatever, right? And they struggle to overcome it. There's a lot of ways you can make these things come together, but we want to see the character struggle, and depending on the style and structure of your story, either overcome it or succumb to the risks and dangers, depending on if you're in the film noir style of things, right? And then there's going to be a lot of sensory details that try and make this story seem real. We want to engage the audience deep into that story, or at least get them to see that the story is about the real world. Then we need sensory details. We need imagery, and this is where the imagery comes in. We need to get an image to show up in their head that they can see. Many people think in combinations of words and images. I actually think a lot more in images than words, but other people are more wordy. But either way, part of your audience will relate to images, and you've probably all read passages in books where you see a mental image, and then you're actually unhappy when you finally see a film, because what the director of the film put in for that imagery is nothing like what's in your head. And it just breaks the story for you, because you've already filled in details and they're so vivid in your mind that you see them, but they're not what's showing up in the film. And that's a classic example of a disconnect between a book and a movie. Okay, so when we put this all together, we have some character related and objectives, and there's some character details. And the characters then got to climb over some problems and conflicts. There's a wall that's going to limit them. And then depending on what's happening in science stories, we talk about what's the state of the art, what's limiting, why is this a limit, why isn't it so trivial to do. And then there's going to be some risks and dangers you have to face either because of these problems or just some stories, they're just ancillary things that fall along the way. We're trying to solve a problem and all of a sudden another problem shows up and then another problem, right? And there's going to be some risks and dangers. And then that's really what happens if the character fails. What happens, right, if it does? And then we're all trying to reach a goal. So this is the core of a story, a nice little graphic to help you understand it. So now I wanted to tell some of these from a couple of different tactical storytelling point of view. And I'm going to actually break this up into 4 examples. And one of the reasons I like to do this is because people sometimes say, well, this is not fiction, right? I can't have my hero and a hero's journey and just make everything up. How could I do this for a tactical objective that's tied to the real world? So all 4 of these examples will be very real world kinds of things, and I've used this in actual practice. So who's the main character for a proposal story? Well, my favorite is to choose someone with whom the funder will emotionally connect. So it might be a named person, it might be somebody who is not named but has like a nameless role, like it's somebody who is trying to figure out how to protect the base as a soldier. If I'm writing to DOD, it might be a homeless person if I'm trying to tell a story about improving housing. You choose a character that the funder will emotionally connect to. And this means you've done your research, you understand a little bit about your funder. You want this emotionally connected, not just logically. You want an emotional connection. We want to have some character traits that make this person interesting, or people. I sometimes will have multiple characters depending on what you're going to do in the proposal. And this is what helps the reader visualize and remember why they care about them. Right? So again, this is a little bit more about why. In this case, it's about why you care about them. And you want a phrase or something that when you use those traits, it's implicitly getting to the motive of the audience to care. Not about the character's goals, but to care about this as a person at some level. And care can include hate, right? Again, you can use this is evil, this is bad, we have to stop the pollution. So someone who's impacted by evil, right, or by pollution, right, we might have something that visualizes them, right? And it doesn't even have to be a person. It could be a fish or turtle, right? Turtles eating up trash bags because they think they look like jellyfish, right? Might be an imagery that will get somebody at the Ocean Foundation to really care. What do we need the character to do? Right? So now I have, if I continue the turtle story, right, I have somebody trying to clean up the ocean and another character which is easily visualized that they care about, right? And we have to have some way that if we're doing a proposal, we're telling them we're going to have some proposed work. We need to have a measure by which I want to make improvement. So I don't want to necessarily make my goal very generic. I might start with a very broad goal, but then I want to narrow it down and have something that's specific enough that I can talk eventually about how to measure it. So if you think back to your SMART objectives, you want your character's goal for a proposal to be SMART. We have to have some reason why that's important to the funder. The ... is because to who? Not to the character, not to you. Why is it important to the funder? What conflicts block the problem? So what makes this hard to do? Why is it not already out there? Because if it wasn't hard to do, then it'd already be done, right? Somebody would be out there doing it. So you have to have some reason. The reason could be financial, it could be scientific, it could be staffing, it could be societal, political, whatever. You've got to have a couple of things in there that make it clear why it's hard to do. And then you have to have something about the risks and dangers if it's not successful. So again, going back to not cleaning up the ocean, right? The ocean's vast, the trash is everywhere, it flows down from rivers, it's hard to get people. There's many, many dimensions that make the problem hard, but the risks and dangers have to do with the pollution in our ocean is producing microplastics for us. It's endangering wildlife, and the loss of wildlife is bad for us in the long run. Right? There's a whole bunch of reasons that the risks and dangers are there. So in a proposal, this one's a little trickier in terms of struggles because you have to talk about what you're proposing that will help the character reach the goal. You won't necessarily have a lot of struggles, but if your proposal can build on preliminary work that shows we've been doing this has been our struggle, and this is what we're struggling, and this is how the proposal will help us further reach the goal, that's great. So if we think of the Opportunity Now proposal that some of you have been working on, then you can think about how are we doing this in an educational setting and how might we make it stronger if we go forward, right? So figuring out what you've been working on and what's going to make it better. And then finally, some sensory details that will make it seem real. And a lot of this depends on how much space and time you have. Um, if you have very little space, you have a very short thing, you definitely want to use a metaphor to make it seem real and make it very quick. Again, tying it back to the visual imagery, that can make it another way of adding some details about the problem and the characters and the goals, whatever. And if you have enough space, then you want to provide some examples of the proposed idea to make it seem real. Again, graphics can help with that, but it can also be a discussion. So that's a proposal story. You can see how we filled in the 8 elements. This one has a pretty clear potential for who is the main character and some of the things. So the second one is a classic kind of thing. It's a marketing story. So who's the main character in a marketing story? The main character is the reader or a person with some generic title similar to the reader's, or it could be somebody that the reader is working towards it with. So if I'm marketing to children, the actual purchaser, the actual customer is generally the parent, then I got to have something that connects to the two of them, but maybe not. Maybe it's just the reader or the person I'm marketing to directly. I have to have some character traits that make them interesting, that make them something of what is expected of the reader. So if the reader is self-identifying because they see something in this character that's like them, that's great. One of the things that makes the marketing story a little bit easier is you generally have a very large audience, and you don't, from a marketing point of view, have to reach all of them. So you can actually make some things, and you can actually make different versions of the same commercial or the same marketing message intended for different audiences. And so you have character traits in one of them that one group will empathize to, and then a different group, a different set of people will relate to. So what is your character need or goal? Well, in this case, you want to think of what is the goal of the reader. So, if the goal of the reader is satisfaction, entertainment, if they have a job to get done, you have to think, what is the job the user wants done, whether it's eating or physical things, and how is your story related to it? So you got to set up that goal, and then you got to set up why that goal is important or desired. And this can be important because maybe it isn't the goal of your reader, but one your reader can actually empathize with and understand. And so you want to figure out how that's going to go. Going back to the cereal example, the children might be interested because it's fun and colorful and tasty and sugary. Mom might be interested because actually, despite its being a cereal, you're marketing to them because it's got these healthy advantages, right? Magic Spoon, right, has none of the sugar, right? It's much more expensive, and so you got to really motivate people to pay them much for it. But you might get them by talking about the important goals of sugar and its health disadvantages, whatever. What are the conflicts that block the character? So what makes it hard to do? Why is this not easy as something to accomplish? So you can tell the story of how you developed it or what's going to happen. And this is one of the places where, right, the conflicts and problems might block the character, might be money, there might be access. And sometimes in marketing, this is one that gets played down a little bit because the conflict is so internal, you never want to mention that I'm making it hard or it is hard to do. So this is the one place where in a marketing story you sort of can fudge on that, right? The risks and dangers are often sometimes also underplayed, like I could go hungry if I don't get the food. Those are implicit to the reader, and so once the reader understands and relates to the character sufficiently, their conflicts and problems and their risks and dangers become the characters, and you can gloss over them a lot more in your marketing message. So this is often not played up as much. On the other hand, if I'm trying to sell cars and I want to talk about the difficulty of making them 5-star safety rated and the risks and dangers of a crash, that might be played up, right? So there's different models where you're trying to motivate them through positive feedback in terms of positive goals, they get satisfied, or fear, in which case you're going to go for more conflict and risk in your marketing story. Then there's what the character does to reach it. So from a proposal point of view, from a marketing point of view, what are you offering that will help the reader to reach their goal, right? What are you proposing that they can do? Whether it's a safer car, whether it's tastier cereal, whether it's games in the back of the box, whatever it is, right? You're going to offering them something to help them reach their goal. And sometimes, again, although I've been doing this from the point of view of the reader is mostly the person the target audience. Sometimes this is about people you care and love about, in which case it's about how you help them get there. And there's plenty of examples of marketing where you're talking to a third party, not the main one. And then you want to show them examples of benefits of the proposed idea to make it seem real. People are much more interested in the benefits, which are reaching the goals and what the goal gives them, than just saying you reached the goal or telling what the features of the system are, or there are a few people for whom that is the benefit, but for most people, they want to see what the benefit would be for them. So now let's do a science or tech story. These are ones where many of my students have struggled with this, and we do a lot of these. So I'm going to do the science tech story, what I'll call version 1. So this is one where we're generally writing for a more scientific audience. And so our main character is often not a person. Instead, it's the science, the tech, the algorithm, the system, or the theory of the paper. So we're telling it in a sort of anthropomorphized fashion, which means we're trying to give our system some characteristics of people. This is tricky for me because I don't like to use the term AI or try and make my system seem intelligent, but I can talk about what the system is doing, and I'll give it some characters that helps them understand why this science tech algorithm, and I'll just keep saying science from now on, why this science works and is better. The why is critically important for the science story, because this is what the reader most wants to get out of it, which is, I see why this science works, which is going to eventually come back to my goal, or back to number 4, my motive, which is, right, improving, let's say I'm improving the accuracy of a system being used for biometrics, then improving that, the system that wants to improve its characteristics, but the goal might be very different, which is so that people are not falsely accused, so that people aren't stopped at the airport as they're trying to go through security, but also so that we stop all the terrorists, right? These are high-level motives for the audience, right? But they're tied to the goal of the science. Then we'd look at, so what conflicts and problems, what makes this hard to do from a science point of view, right? Why is prior work failed to achieve these objectives is a classic part of any good science paper. And so you're sort of explaining not just that they didn't, but why didn't they? What did they do? What didn't they do that you're doing that's going to help you solve it, and what are the problems they left? And then again, what are the risks and dangers if you're not successful in making the system better? In the sort of what the character struggles to do to reach the goal, this is another place where it gets a little tricky. You can talk about like the difficulty in the system, but then we have this thing we'll call ablation studies, or we'll do experiments on parts that really answer more of the questions about, going back to the traits, what makes this really work? So if I did 2 or 3 things, I might do, here's what happens if I do only A, then only B, then only C, but when you put them all together, you get a much better system. That's the kind of things that would show up in a text story or a science story. And then we're going to look at what sensory details will make the story seem real. And often we do that in part by analogy. Here's prior work, here's what they did, here's what we do. And then we'll add examples of success and some examples of failure cases to sort of explain what works and what doesn't, because again, that's a little bit of the why, but it also makes it seem real. No one's going to believe your system has no flaws, then it always works. So by including some failure cases, you get them to see, oh look, it fails, but that failure is not so bad, and it makes it all seem far more realistic and more credible that you're putting this all together. So the second kind of science tech story, I actually like these. I find them far more effective, and I've had a number of papers like this that have been very successful, where we actually have a real main character. It's someone impacted by the results of the science and tech. So again, going back to that biometric example I mentioned in the previous slide, right? Instead of talking about the system as the main character might be somebody who is a security operator at an airport, and they have lots of people going through, and they're dealing with the frustration of false alarms. Or it might be somebody who is actually in jail because of a false detection. Lots of things can make it someone who's impacted. We even had one where we did the story was about the engineer who's building systems using machine learning tools and the difficulties they face and how we're helping that person. That's a particularly impactful choice of a character, because the readers who are reviewing the papers and the audience who's going to read the paper are generally going to be machine learning engineers who are working on this problem, and so they can instantly relate to this character. So it's going back to the first kind of proposal character, where it's like, this is me. I see how this benefits me directly, and we'll see how that can be super important. So again, the traits that make the character relatable to the reader, or whatever that someone that's going to be impacted is, or the reader themselves. A few things that make them more relatable so that they're not just there. And again, it might just be one term used to describe them. So we used in the example I talked about where we're trying to relate to the network engineer, machine learning engineer, we talked about the network engineer and their fear of their system not working, agnostophobia, the fear of the unknown, and we kept using that phrase throughout it. It's a relatively uncommon word, so the audience instantly sees that and relates it to the entire question of the fear of your system failing because of the unknown inputs. What do they need to get? So what's the end result or the science? And then how are you going to measure that when you try and beat the state of the art? So again, what is your goal? And then why is that result or the science important from a property point of view? What makes it hard to do? What are the risks and dangers? Again, these are relatively straightforward from the same as the last story. And then the ablation study experiments, right? All of those are really the same as the text story version 1. The only thing we really changed here is the main character, the traits, and a little bit about maybe the characters, what they're trying to do. But mostly changing the character radically changes the way the story is perceived by the audience. Okay, so again, going back to our science, or these previous examples, right? When we look at the storytelling triangle, we have the audience, the story, and you, and the author. But as we look at that from the tactical objective, we have from a proposal the objective of getting the audience to understand why they want to fund us. We want them to fund us is the tactical objective. In the marketing story, we want them to buy. In the science stories, we want them to accept our papers, to read our papers, maybe build on top of our work. Very different tactical objectives. In some of them, we want to be very clear explaining what the objective is. But in the marketing story, it's implicit. People know why they're being marketed to, or maybe you don't want to tell them. You want them to feel influenced and buy, but you don't want to make it a very aggressive sales call. If you tell people you're trying to sell them something, the first thing many people want to do is reach for their wallet and protect it so you can't get to it. They don't want to be sold. And so you have to think about, as you're telling the story and trying to reach your audience, what do you say about the tactical objective? Do you leave it implicit, explicit? And so you're going to want to go through that. But you have to get into the risks and dangers, right? They're always there. You may not tell the audience that they're there, but they're going to be there. And they drive all stories. That doesn't mean stories are about failure. There are challenges along the road to success. And so you can have the gap filling we talked about. Let the audience imagine the gap all by themselves, fill it in the potential risks and dangers, and then you go from a situation where there's an implicit risk to success, and the audience makes that jump with you and they feel connected. And when we talk about dangers, right, do we mean physical dangers? Absolutely not, right? Any emotional, mental, societal, professional, physical danger will do. Anything. So the embarrassment, risk of rejection, lack of knowledge, understanding, lack of information, failure of being ridiculed, belittled, being laughed at, abandoned, scorned, all of these are fears. And in science and engineering, the audience is so steeped in doing lots of things that actual scientific objectives of like accuracy, speed, and cost, they're also dangerous. They may not seem it to the average person looking at the paper, but that's because they don't have the mental knowledge and the shared knowledge that all the scientists do. And so for a scientist to say, I'm going to improve accuracy by 2%, that the audience generally has some implicit understanding of the risks of 2% more errors in the application, to the point where, you know, they sometimes get ridiculed by other people because, well, who cares about that, right? But if that in improved accuracy saves 2 people's lives, implicitly it's not even talking about the paper because we're trying to keep them short, then it's really a risk or a danger. And so you have to understand the audience's interpretation of danger will vary depending on the audience. So you have to put them together. So this is actually, I'm going to go ahead and stop here. This is the end of part 1 of the video. I'm going to break it into 3 parts so you don't have a massively long video. And this ends sort of a little bit about the background. And we're going to pick up the next video with an overview of the 9 major steps of tactical story generation. But I want you to get up, take a quick break, walk around a little bit, and then come back and watch the next video.